Hi all, today we'll discuss about Java with Spring Cloud, Spring Boot, Microservices, real-time interview questions with DevOps and database. So there are multiple questions which may interviewer will ask related for a Spring Cloud. So the first question is what is a Spring Cloud? So a Spring Cloud bus is linked node for the distributed system using lightweight message broker like Kafka, RabbitMQ to broadcast state changes like config changes and event changes. For that purpose, we are using a Spring Cloud bus, which is used to distributed system using Kafka and RabbitMQ. Now, the next question is how does a Spring Cloud bus help with dynamic configuration? So, if you want to use dynamic configurations, it helps to propagate config changes across all the server by broadcasting. So, slash actuator bus refresh event without restarting the applications. So we need to use bus refresh slash actuator slash bus refresh. Now the next question is what dependency are required for a Spring Cloud bus with this Kafka. So while we use a Spring Cloud bus with Kafka for the dependency, we have a Spring Cloud starter bus Kafka, which is used for the bus with Kafka, Spring Cloud bus with Kafka, which need to be add this dependency in pom.xml or Gradle, anyone. Now the next question is how to refresh config changes in one instance using config Spring Cloud bus. So if you want to change this config, refresh the config changes. For that purpose, we have used in point post slash actuator slash bus refresh and destinations which we have to mention. Examples: services name and instance ID we have to do. The next question is how do you secure a Spring Cloud bus endpoint? So if you want to secure a Spring Cloud bus endpoint using a Spring security to protect actuator endpoint like slash actuator slash bus refresh with this authentications and authorizations. Now the next question is a Spring Cloud, a Spring Web Flux. So if you want to use a Spring Web Flux, so the interviewer will ask a Spring Web Flux related interview questions. So what is a Spring Web Flux? So Spring Web Flux is a reactive stack web frame built in Project Reactor and support asynchronous and non-blocking processing. So a Spring Web Flux mostly used for the asynchronous and non-blocking processing. So the next question is what is mono and flux? So the mono is used for the 0 to 1 result where we have mono and any type of users, anything which you are developing. The flux is used for the 0 to n result. So the flux we have to use flux and then users mention examples. Now the next question is what is the difference between WebMVC and WebFlux? So WebMVC blocking is yes and WebFlux blocking is no. Performance moderate in MVC and WebFlux has high asynchronous performance in this WebFlux. Reactive API in MVC is not, but in WebFlux we are using reactors. Now the next question is how do you handle error in a Spring WebFlux? So use on error resume and do on error controller advice with exception handler. So either we have to use on error resume, do on errors, and controller advice with an at the rate exception handler. Now the next question is how to test web flux endpoint. So use web test client for functional testing. Use web test client for functional testing. The next question is related for cloud AWS PCF. How do you deploy Spring Boot applications to AWS? To deploy the Spring Boot application on AWS, we have to use Open Elastic Beanstalk EC2 instance and then ECS with Docker. So and Lambda for a small services and all. So these all are the services which we have to use for the cloud while we are deploying any Spring Boot applications and all. The next question is what is AWS parameters store and secret manager? So services for storing secure configurations value and secret which can be used by Spring Boot via Spring Cloud AWS. services for storing the secure configurations value and secret which can be used by Spring Boot via Spring Cloud AWS. Now the next question is what is the use of a Spring Cloud config in cloud? So why we use Spring Cloud config in cloud? To centralize the config management for the microservices environment, prod, dev and stage. Now the next question is how to scale a Spring Boot app in PCF Kubernetes. So by configuring instance count or SPA like horizontal pod autoscalers in Kubernetes. Now the next question is what is 12 factor app in the cloud context? A set of principles to build a scalable and maintainable cloud native app. We will use 12 factors app like config is the environment statelet process. Now the question is related for DevOps tools integrations. While we are using a Spring Boot, a Spring Cloud Bus related interview questions in that, or if you are developing anything for that, DevOps related questions will be there. So how does Jenkins fit in your Spring Boot CI/CD pipeline? So Jenkins pull this code with built-in Maven, run the unit test cases, build the Docker image, and deploy in the environment. So Jenkins pull code is used for this type of cycle. Now the next question is how do you use Dockers with a Spring Boot? So the Dockers we will use for the centralized Spring Boot application for consistency across environment and better deployments. Now the next question is how do you write a Docker file for the Spring Boot? So to write the Docker file, we have to use this form OpenJDK copy target endpoint of Java jar app.jar. This is the format examples we have to create a Docker image. Now the next question is how do you monitor a Spring Boot app in production? To monitor a Spring Boot app in production, use actuators, ELK, Elastic, Logstash, Kibana, or Prometheus and Grafana. Now the next question is what is Helm and how is it used for the Spring Boot app? So Helm is a package manager for Kubernetes. It's help for the deploy a Spring Boot app using reusable chart. Now the next question is real-time microservices plus database. How do you handle schema migrations in microservices? So use Flyway or Liquibase to version DB change and run them on a startup. The next question is related to how do you design database in microservice architectures. So each service should its DB per patterns. So for query across services, use API compositions or CQRS for this designer database in microservices architectures. Now the next question is how do you handle distributed transactions? So while we handle distributed transactions, use Saga patterns or outbox patterns for maintaining eventual consistency. Now the next question is which reactive database library have to use for the Spring Web Flux? So R2DBC for SQL or reactive Mango DB for NoSQL, MongoDB. So these all are the database which we are using for the Spring Web Flux. Now the next question is how do you cache DB query in a Spring Boot? So use a Spring caches with Redis for the caching frequently accessed data. Now the next question is related for real-time scenario-based interview questions. So how to implement real-time config update across 10 microservices? So use a Spring Cloud config with a Spring Cloud Bus plus RabbitMQ or Kafka for broadcasting actuators bus refresh we will use. Now the next question is if you receive 1000 requests second in Webflux, how do you handle this service for this load? So use Webflux non-blocking, native server, reactive DB, R2DBC, and fine turn thread tools with back process handling. Now the next question is how do you secure reactive services? Use security web filter change JWT tokens for authentications and role based for authorization. Now the next question is how do you implement service discovery in a Spring Cloud? So use Netflix Eureka or console for the dynamic service integrations with discovery. Now the next question is, how do you handle failure between microservices? So use Spring Cloud circuit breakers like resilience forge, retry mechanism, and fallback logic. So these all are the top 30 interview questions which is related for Spring Cloud bus with Kafka, with the Spring Boot microservices, and DevOps with cloud deployments and all. Yeah, thank you.